A British railway legend set out to save steam power by building the most advanced locomotive ever imagined. But when Oliver Bulleid's masterpiece rolled onto the rails, it hid a horrifying secret. The crew were not beside the fire, they were inside it. Sealed in a suffocating steel corridor, men endured 120 degrees of heat and the choking air of their own engine, earning the machine its notorious nickname, the Oven. Why would anyone send men into a pressure cooker on wheels? And how did one bold gamble become the most infamous train disaster you have never heard of? Steam had ruled Britain's rails for a century, but after the war, the numbers no longer added up. In 1947, government accountants pored over the ledgers of the newly nationalized British railways. Their verdict was cold: cut costs, modernize, or face collapse. Traffic forecasts predicted surging demand, but the old engines could not keep up. Steam engines needed hours to wake up, mountains of coal, and armies of men just to get moving. In winter, pipes froze and locomotives stalled in the yard. Every breakdown meant delays, every delay meant lost freight contracts and angry letters from Whitehall. The new diesel tenders arriving from America promised a future with fewer headaches. They started at the turn of a key, ran day and night, and needed only a handful of crew. Maintenance budgets were slashed, managers were told to find savings anywhere they could. Reports from 1948 and 1949 set targets so sharp, entire workshops closed overnight. The pressure was relentless. Steam was labeled dirty, expensive, and outdated. But in the middle of this squeeze, a small group of engineers still believed they could beat the odds. They saw a way to give steam a second life, not by clinging to the past, but by reinventing it. For them, the only hope was to build something so advanced, so different, it could silence the critics and save thousands of jobs. The stage was set: adapt or disappear. Oliver Bulleid didn't believe in half measures. He walked into the British Railways boardroom with a stack of blueprints and an idea that sounded more like science fiction than railway engineering. His plan was simple in theory: build a steam locomotive that could outclass any diesel, not just in speed, but in cleanliness and efficiency. He called it the Leader. The promise was bold: 90 miles an hour, double-ended cabs for easy reversals, and no need for a turntable. The engine would glide down the tracks like a modern express, its moving parts hidden away, protected from the grime and weather. Bulleid spoke of a future where steam was civilized, where engines would run day and night with barely a whisper of maintenance. He pitched the project as a lifeline for steam, a way to save thousands of jobs and prove that British engineering could still lead the world. The Leader's shape was like nothing else: a smooth, windowless slab of steel with no wheels or chimney in sight. It was a train built to look like tomorrow. The engineers in the room listened, some skeptical, some swept up in the vision. For the men assigned to test it, though, the project felt less like a rescue and more like a gamble. The fireman, me, got the assignment with a handshake and a warning: Bulleid's a genius, but you'll need guts for this one. No one mentioned what it would feel like to work in the heart of that steel box. Not yet. For now, all anyone could see was the promise of something new, and the hope that steam could survive a little longer. The Leader didn't just look different, it worked differently, right down to its bones. Instead of the familiar tangle of rods and levers thrashing alongside the wheels, Bulleid's design buried everything inside. Power from the steam cylinders did not travel through exposed rods. Instead, it moved through heavy-duty chains, like a bicycle scaled up to the size of a rail car. Each bogie, 6 wheels apiece, was driven by chains running in a sealed steel box deep inside the frame. The chains splashed through a sump holding 40 gallons of oil, meant to keep every link and bearing slick and cool at high speed. This oil bath was supposed to be the secret weapon. No more grit grinding into joints, no more grease-caked rods flailing in the rain. With every moving part hidden away, maintenance would be as simple as topping up the oil and checking the seals. Bulleid wanted the chains to run quietly, protected from the filth and weather that wore down ordinary steam engines. He even borrowed techniques from car engines and aircraft, adding spray pipes and pumps to keep the oil moving over the critical parts. The idea was simple. If you could keep the chains submerged and the bearings wet, you could run for miles without worrying about breakdowns. But sealing all that oil inside a moving furnace was no small feat. The welds had to be perfect. Every joint, every seam, every bolt had to hold back hot, churning oil hour after hour. Even the smallest crack could let oil escape, dripping down onto the wheels or brakes below. The casing was a fortress, but it was also a trap. Any weakness, corrosion, a bad weld, a missed inspection turned the oil bath from a safeguard into a source of danger. The chain drive was a marvel on paper, but in practice, it was always one leak away from disaster. What was meant to be an engineering breakthrough became the engine's ticking time bomb. The blueprints for the leader showed a locomotive that barely resembled anything that had come before. The biggest surprise was not just what was missing on the outside, no rods, no chimney, no exposed wheels, but what had been pushed aside on the inside. To make room for a walkway running the length of the engine, the boiler was not centered. It was shoved 18 inches off the main axis, its bulk pressed up against one side of the steel shell. This was not a mistake or a shortcut. It was the only way to fit a corridor through the heart of the machine without breaking up the sleek, sealed bodywork Bulleid demanded. That corridor became the fireman's world. It was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, running alongside the boiler and the water tanks. The walls were steel, hot to the touch after a few miles, and the ceiling pressed close overhead. There was no window to the outside, no way to see daylight. The only light came from the dull orange glow of the fire hole ahead. At its tightest, the passage narrowed to less than 3 feet. At full stretch, it ran nearly 40 feet from the front cab to the firebox compartment, separating the fireman from the driver by the length of a city bus. The corridor was not just a strange design quirk. It was a direct result of Bulleid's vision, a train that could be driven from either end like a subway car, with the fireman stationed in the middle to tend the fire. But this meant the fireman was sealed in, surrounded on one side by boiling water and on the other by a mass of coal and steel. The lopsided boiler, hidden by the casing, made the engine look balanced from the outside. Inside, it was anything but. The fireman's tunnel was more than a shortcut. It was a test of endurance, a place where every step brought you deeper into the machine's core and farther from help. This spatial compromise set the stage for everything that followed. The offset boiler, the cramped tunnel, the steel walls that radiated heat. These choices were not just technical details. They shaped every moment the crew spent inside, and they turned a design meant to save steam into a nightmare of isolation and heat. The first time the heat really hit, it was not a gradual sweat. It was like walking straight into a furnace. The gauge on the bulkhead, meant to reassure, only made things worse. The needle pressed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit and kept climbing. The air inside the tunnel thickened, heavy with steam and the sharp tang of hot oil. Every surface radiated warmth. The steel walls, the firebox door, even the shovel handle felt like they had been left in an oven. Sweat poured down my back and stung my eyes. My shirt clung to my skin, soaked through in minutes. Breathing was like sucking air through a wet rag, each lungful tasting of coal dust and something metallic. Inside that tunnel, time stretched and twisted. The firebox glowed a deep orange, throwing out waves of heat that made the air shimmer. I tried to keep count of the shovelfuls, 10, 20, 50, but the numbers slipped away. The only sound was the scrape of coal and the distant growl of the engine, muffled by the steel shell. My heart pounded in my ears. My arms ached. Every few minutes I would glance at the thermograph, hoping for some relief, but the numbers never dropped. I wiped sweat from my brow and tried to focus on the rhythm, open the door, throw the coal, shut it quick before the heat roared out again. There was no breeze, no window, no escape. The only connection to the outside world was the bell system, a single chime from the driver, 40 feet away, lost in the roar. My hands started to tremble. The skin on my forearms burned where it brushed the firebox. I could feel the heat pressing in from all sides, squeezing the air from my lungs. Somewhere behind me, the water gauge hissed, a reminder that the only thing separating me from 1,000 gallons of boiling water was a few inches of steel and brick. I held on, shovel after shovel, knowing that if I stopped, the fire would die and the whole machine would grind to a halt. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was making it through the next breath, the next shovelful, the next impossible minute. 40 feet. That's how far I was from the driver, just steel, boiling water, and coal between us. No window, no sightline, no voice. The only link was a single tone bell strung through the shell. 1 ring meant stop. 2 meant go. Sometimes the bell would misfire, echoing down the tunnel in a way that made my heart jump. Was it 1 chime or 2? Did he mean stop? Or was it just the engine shaking the wires again? I'd freeze, shovel held midair, sweat running into my eyes, listening for a second ring that might never come. Down at this end, the roar of the fire drowned out everything. I learned to count the seconds between bells, guessing at the driver's mood by the rhythm. Sometimes, in the thick of the heat, I'd imagine he'd forgotten I was even there. The world outside was just a rumor, a blur of green glimpsed through a crack in the bulkhead when the door creaked open. My job was to keep the fire alive, whatever the bell said. There were stretches where I'd go half an hour without a signal. In that time, it was just me and the fire, the sweat, the sound of my own breathing. The tunnel pressed in, every surface radiating heat, the air thick and close. The longer the silence stretched, the more my mind started to wander. Was the driver asleep at the controls? Had we stopped? Was something wrong with the water? Panic would creep in, slow and sticky, until the bell rang again, breaking the spell, reminding me I was still needed, still trapped in the middle of this machine. Sometimes a misfire of the bell would send me scrambling for the emergency brake, convinced the train was about to derail, only to realize it was just a loose connection or a bump in the track. Every mistake felt like a threat. Every silence felt like abandonment. In that tunnel, isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental. The longer I spent sealed away from the world, the more the heat and the noise got inside my head. I started to talk to myself just to hear a human voice. The bell was my only company, a lifeline stretched thin by distance and steel. Each shift chipped away at something inside me, leaving only the rhythm of the shovel and the hope that, somewhere up front, the driver was still listening. The worst happened halfway up the grade, with the boiler roaring and the tunnel hotter than a foundry. I heard a sound from beneath, like a kettle boiling over but sharper. Then the smell hit, burning oil, thick and sharp, filling the corridor before I even had time to shout. Oil from the chain drive had found its way past the seals, dripping down onto the spinning wheels and brake shoes. 1 spark was all it took. Flames licked up from the underside, lighting the steel floor red and sending black smoke curling through every seam in the casing. The engine didn't slow. The driver, 40 feet ahead, couldn't see what was happening. I hammered the emergency bell, but the signal wires had already started to stretch in the heat. My hand slipped on the shovel, sweat pouring into my eyes as I tried to keep breathing through the oily haze. The temperature spiked, hotter than anything I'd felt, the air so thick it felt like drowning standing up. Oil splattered across the firebox wall, hissing and spitting where it met the heat. There was nowhere to go. The only way out was forward, through the tunnel and past the flames. I pressed myself against the wall, boots slipping on the slick floor, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the engine anymore. For 25 miles, the fire chased us up the hill, every bump threatening to send burning oil splashing higher. By the time we crested the summit, I'd lost all sense of time. My shirt was soaked, my lungs raw. I staggered out at the first stop, gasping for air. The image of flames under my feet burned into memory. That was the day I realized this machine could kill you before you ever left the rails. By the spring of 1951, the numbers on the boardroom table spoke louder than any promise of innovation. The LEADER project had swallowed £178,000, a staggering sum for 5 unfinished prototypes that spent more time in workshops than on the rails. Internal reports logged breakdowns after barely 100 miles of running. Oil leaks, fires, and shattered brick linings filled the maintenance logs. The union's complaints grew louder, and the fireman's refusal to crew the engine forced management's hand. Minutes from British Railways board meetings show a sharp change in tone. The experiment was now a liability, not a lifeline. Scrap invoices began to pile up. One by one, the prototypes were towed into the yards at Eastleigh and Ashford, stripped of anything salvageable and cut apart. Official orders left no room for sentiment. By the end of 1952, every trace of the LEADER had been reduced to scrap metal. Not a single unit survived. The last entry in the project ledger was Bulleid's own departure. In February 1951, he resigned and left for Ireland, leaving his vision behind in the cutting torch's glare. Steam's last hope had become an embarrassment, abandoned by both the men who ran it and the men who built it. The board closed the file. The age of steam, at least in Britain, was over. Today, as automation reshapes every workplace, the lesson endures. Innovation without empathy risks turning ambition into agony. The LEADER didn't just test metal, it tested the limits of human endurance for progress. Every modern engineer faces the same question: does efficiency justify the human cost? In every sealed cockpit and every automated line, that answer still matters. Would you get inside for the promise of the future? Let's talk below.